Hi everyone. Is that okay, microphone-wise? Yeah. Okay, thank you, Blue. A nice introduction. You have a quick survey, which has nothing really to do with the talk. Who saw a tunnel and who saw the top of a pyramid looking down? Tunnel? Ah, tunnel crowd. Okay. Right. That doesn't mean anything. I was just curious. So yes, you were listening to a piece of music by Daphne Oram, oh, here it comes again, who is a sort of guiding spirit for some of this talk and was very invested in the world we're going to explore. And we'll talk a little bit about her in a bit, but she was a founding member of the legendary BBC Radiophonic Workshop and incredible composer and human. So, each human being is an instrument of concord and discord, consisting of thousands upon thousands of finely tuned circuits, a whole spectrum of resonating frequencies which are never at rest, never in a steady state, but are vibrant with pulsating tension. Like the intricate groove of a gramophone record, the resulting soundtrack would be extremely difficult to analyze in all its aspects, for there would be so many components in a state of flux. Yet it would exist as an entity, as a resultant whole, as a vast tangible river of flowing tensions. And that's an extract from Daphne Oram's book, An Individual Note of Music, Sound and Electronics, in which she kind of presents a lot of her ideas about sound and music, which has recently been republished after many years out of print by Sound and Music, the sort of music organisation, and it's a very special, if quite strange, text. Here's Daphne. So yes, as I said, she was a British composer, musician, and inventor who began working with tape recorders at the BBC during the 1940s, and then in 1958 set up the BBC Radiophonic Workshop with Desmond Briscoe, although she left it not long afterwards to work on her own compositions and experiments, including what you can see here, which is the now quite famous Aramix system for converting doodles and images into sound frequencies. And this was actually 2 or 3 years ago, has been sort of taken out. The actual machine has been restored and is on display at the Science Museum in London as a permanent exhibit now, which is quite wonderful. And her archive, I think, is at the University of Manchester, and there's a lot of work going on there. So it's hardly surprising that someone so fascinated with the intricacies of sound would be drawn to metaphysical and techno-magical ideas about our pulsating, humming, and vibrating universe. And riffing on Enlightenment scientist and philosopher Francis Bacon, in 1960, Oram imagined an animistic future in which sound could heal bodies and minds. This is her actual note, but I'll read it for you so you have to read her handwriting. The New Atlantis. We also have sound houses where we practice the healing powers of sound, where we analyze each human being's innate waveform and induce those harmonics to resonate which have fallen out of sorts, where the criminal is put into a harmless, restful sleep until his mental powers have come to terms with themselves, and he is again in harmony with mankind, where man and beast are given the means of communication one to the other, so that man despises not the animal kingdom nor any other form of life, no, nor even the inanimate, but humbly learns the wisdom derived from contact with another aspect. Here we learn the harmonic series of the elements, the cycles of the years, the oscillations of the tides, and the induced frequency resonances from those forces far out in space. We explore the sounds which move boulders, the overtones which transmute the metals, but moreover we acknowledge the wavelength of our own time and respect the existence of beings without that time. Finding thereby means to produce summation tones penetrating the very fundamentals of these worlds beyond our frontiers. For here we excite, by the subtle higher frequencies, the inner consciousness of man, linking him in truth with the infinite timelessness of that still point where all is comprehended. Orem's researches into the energetic potential of sound eventually led her in the 1950s to the work of George and Marjorie de la Warre, and this is George de la Warre at their home in Oxford with one of his diagnostic radionic instruments. George was a professional engineer and Marjorie was the daughter of a scientist, and together they ran de la Warre Laboratories, where for almost 4 decades they developed an incredible range of seemingly impossible technologies. These included sonic healing devices of the kind that Orem had dreamed of, color and light projecting healing machines, energetic or radionic healing devices, and perhaps most spectacular of all, a camera, which you can see here along with part of the blueprints. And in 1955, they received French patent number 1,084,318, titled Improvements in Research into Fundamental Radiation. And the de la Warres took between 8 and 12,000 photographs with their camera, photographs of images either divined or projected from the mind of the camera's operator. These were often images of medical conditions focused upon by the operator using a sample of blood, hair, or other materials as a starting point, but they could also be psychometric impressions drawn from an object, as in the case of the image here on the left, taken using the camera and printed in Mind and Matter Quarterly Journal in December 1959, or the more familiar auric image as seen on the right here, and that's Marjorie herself in a kind of mediumistic state. I'm not sure what that is on the left. I sort of sometimes think it's a little tiki pot, that's a bit more sinister than that. So the de la Warre camera encourages comparison with the projected photographic techniques of Japan's Mifune Shizuko in the early 1900s, and more famously perhaps America's Ted Sirius in the 1970s, and all the attendant problems of their claims. I don't know if you're familiar with Ted Sirius, but his kind of special talent was to project images onto he'd have a camera facing him, and he could project an image onto the film, and when it was developed, the image would appear on it. It's a long story, and he probably wasn't actually doing that bit, which is a shame. If you look him up, you'll see a lot of the images, very famous ones of St. Paul's Cathedral during the Blitz, for example, but they've been demonstrated to be pre-existing photographs. But the real focus of the de la Warre's laboratories was healing, and we can learn of a typical diagnostic routine from the 1973 book report on radionics, which goes like this. A hair from an unwell cow was brought to the laboratories and analysed using the de la Warre diagnostic radionic instrument. This allowed the operator to tune in to the source of the cow's malaise using a system of dials and touch plates, which are described later. Using the diagnostic instrument, the operator ascertained that there were foreign bodies in the cow's stomach, at which point a radionic photograph using the camera was taken, again using the cow's hair as its source, and this did indeed reveal a stone and a piece of metal in the cow's stomach, which could then be removed by a mystified vet. What? You may well be asking. what on earth is going on? How in the space of a few slides have we moved from the world of early electronic music to that of psychic photography and vibrational healing? How did this happen? Let's take a few steps beyond the black box and go back to the beginning. In his 1985 book, On the Frontiers of Science, Strange Machines That You Can Build, a favourite read of William S. Burroughs, former missile engineer Harry Stein describes building a classic piece of magical technology, a wishing machine, and this is, your handout is actually a take-home wishing machine that you can all use at any time, but we'll actually describe what you have in more detail later, but bear in mind that what you have is something quite special. This is the very simplest form of the wishing machine, and for such a formidable sounding object, there's not much to it. Just a standard transistor audio amplifier fitted with metal plates, which allow objects such as photographs, hair, blood, or even pesticides to be incorporated into the circuit. So you can see here, the plates are on the left. In this case, there's a photograph inserted between the plates, and they eventually run through an audio amplifier into an antenna, which then can project energies from the object being analysed out into the world. Beginning in the 1950s, Stein, who was himself a committed scientist and rationalist who actually worked at the White Sands missile range in New Mexico, America, had set out to construct and test a range of what he termed impossible technologies, from dowsing rods to razor-sharpening pyramids. And he found, to his dismay and his surprise, that they all seemed to work. But the very premise of a machine that amplified thoughts or wishes and manifested them in reality was just beyond the pale. It was, he wrote, the most atrocious and impossible of all the strange machines I have ever encountered. He was reluctant to even include the machine in his book, partly because of the absurd nature of its claims, and partly because of its terrible potential, like the genie's lamp or the black boxes in any number of Twilight Zone episodes, if it actually worked as described. But Stein's engineering curiosity won out, and he knew that he had to test his machine, and in the late 1950s, he used this most impossible technology to perform an ancient act of witchcraft. His young daughter was suffering from a terrible eruption of warts which seemed unaffected by conventional and painful treatments and were beginning to threaten her health. So he placed a wart-free photograph of his daughter between the plates on the device, switched on the batteries, and over the course of several days thought intensely about ridding her of her affliction. Within 3 days there was a marked improvement in her condition, and 4 weeks later the warts had disappeared. So was this due to a natural healing process, or, as Stein himself came to believe, had the wishing machine effected a cure? Now every culture has traditions of wart charming, using whatever tools are available to them, whether it be raw meat or buried potatoes, decapitated eels, or sliced onions. But Stein deployed a tool that he, as a technologically minded scientist, saw as being appropriate to the task at hand. And Stein's wishing machine is a simplified variant on a range of enigmatic technologies known as psionic, which is a word that merges psi or psychic phenomena with electronics, or radionic, merging radio or radiation with electronics, technologies developed in the early part of the 20th century and still very popular in contemporary New Age and alternative medicine circles. And perhaps the best known has a US patent. This is known as the Hieronymus Device. And this patent was awarded, as I think you can see, on the 27th of September it was awarded 27th of September, but that one was filed in October 1946. And it describes a machine for detecting the presence of and analysing and measuring the quantity or intensity of elements through the capture and analysis of radiations emanating from the said elements, whether they be of electrical or optical characteristics, or both. And this speculative both at the end of that last paragraph belies the deeply strange nature of the patent. And the machine, the Hieronymus machine, works like this, much as the wishing machine does. The item to be analysed, so again, maybe a photograph, a mineral, or a blood sample, is placed next to a coil of wire, a pickup, which then sends an electrical signal via a rotating glass prism and an electrical amplifier to another coil beneath a plate of glass or plastic. While stroking this plate, the user rotates or tunes the prism until they sense a change in the way the plate feels to the touch. It's generally said to feel sticky. And when you have tuned the prism to a pre-existing chart of known tunings, then you've identified what your sample is. And the device eventually would come with a sort of telephone directory of numbers of tunings that you could use to identify anything from viruses, diseases, bacteria to minerals. So you're kind of, these were the kind of the actual vibrational frequencies of matter itself. And modifications made to the original design would allow you to diagnose illnesses and then turning these energies around, cure them. So this is Thomas Galen Hieronymus, a telephone engineer for the Kansas City Power and Light Company who developed the patent. But he himself was as puzzled as you probably are as to what he'd found. What actually happens at the detector to increase its drag to the touch of the operator isn't known, but the apparatus functions, and a positively acting analyzer for atomic radiations is produced, even though the principle on which it is based is not fully known. And he'd been working with these emanations, which he termed eloptic, for both electrical and optical, hence the both in his patent description. These eloptic radiations for about 20 years by the time he filed his patent in the 40s. And taking another step backwards, he was modifying boxes developed by the radionic field's founding father, this man, Albert Abrahams, who in the 1880s received a medical doctorate from the prestigious University of Heidelberg, where he gained a reputation for diagnosing illnesses through a series of physical taps upon the body, which you can see him doing here on the right later in life, which he called percussions. And on returning to his native California within a few years, was the professor of pathology at Cooper Medical College, which is now part of Stanford University. So he was a highly respectable, highly trained medical professional. And over time, he extended his diagnostic methods, discovering that different diseases cause tissues to vibrate at different frequencies, and developed a series of technological devices with names such as the reflexophone and the dynamizer to measure them. And his theory then evolved to suggest that if you could turn these frequencies around and blast them back at the affected tissues, one could effectively cleanse the tissues of disease. This is one of his most famous devices, the oscilloclast. And this combined, when attached to the body of a healthy young man whose abdomen could be used for percussing, allowed remote diagnosis and treatments of patients many miles away to be made from simply a blood or hair sample. And Abrahams promoted this new system, the Electronic Reactions of Abrahams, ERA, with a book called New Concepts in Diagnosis and Treatment, published in 1916. And by 1923, over 3,000 doctors in America were using these devices at work. And here's a diagram from the book on how it operates. So you can see at the top, it's very clearly marked. Note, the subject is not the patient. The subject is the young man standing upright. So the doctor is percussing on his abdomen to kind of sense the sort of vibrational frequency of the illness. That is connected up to the oscilloclast, along with the hair or blood sample from the afflicted patient, who could be miles away, and the correct frequency is then beamed out of the device through the ether, or whatever you want to call it, and helps to heal the patient. So it's effectively, as we'll discuss, witchcraft. But the income from his invention, the oscilloclast, and the licenses that he sold to doctors to use it, made Abrahams a multi-millionaire and garnered him many influential supporters, including the very highly respected journalist and writer Upton Sinclair, who wrote a positive article about him for Pearson's magazine in June 1922. And Sinclair also conducted the first live radio telepathy experiment around the same time. But by the time of Abraham's death in 1924, attacks on his ideas had grown increasingly vociferous. The Lancet, the British medical journal, claimed that samples of healthy chicken blood sent to ERA practitioners to work from had been diagnosed as having several major diseases that hadn't been checked for, while the Scientific American report reached the damning conclusion that, at best, the Abrahams method is an illusion, at worst, it's a colossal fraud. And by 1936, the American Medical Association had denounced Abrahams as the most finished medical charlatan of our time. Coming back to Thomas Galen Hieronymus, so another 20 years later, in the 1940s, while Hieronymus never fully understood the source of his eloptic emanations, he wondered aloud in Analog magazine in the 1970s whether eloptic radiation might be a form of energy from the sun that is probably non-electromagnetic in nature. So the point is, nobody really knew what this force was, what these forces were, only that they worked and something happened when you manipulated them. And Galen was probably aware, as was perhaps Abrahams, that his eloptic energies were part of an ongoing tradition of hypothetical etheric forces, some of them accepted, at least for a while, by the orthodox scientific community, and these included the luminiferous ether, Baron von Reichenbach's odd, the vibrational universe of the Theosophists, William Reich's orgone, Planck and Einstein's zero-point energy, David Bohm's implicate order, and today's favourite candidates of dark matter and dark energy. So, whatever time you slice into the history of emptiness, there's always something there. Scientists, it seems, abhor empty space. So, Thomas Galen Hieronymus's Mystery Machine would gain in further notoriety in the 1950s when John W. Campbell, seen here on the right with L. Ron Hubbard, editor of Astounding Science Fiction magazine and a dedicated electrical tinkerer, built one purely in order to show that it couldn't possibly work. And as a man himself, Campbell was admired and not well liked. Kingsley Amis wrote of him in his 1960 survey of the science fiction field, New Maps of Hell. I should add as a sociological note that the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, John Campbell, is a deviant figure of marked ferocity, and he seems to think he's invented a psionic machine. Campbell liked to take on controversial positions in politics, often veering towards the right, and in science, and it was him who actually gave L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics, which later became Scientology, its first outing. A heavy smoker, he also refused to accept that smoking would be connected to lung cancer, and we might see him as a fellow traveller of the founder of the Fortean Society, Tiffany Thayer. But he gamely took on the problem of the Hieronymus machine and found himself with an interesting problem. It worked. So he wrote about it in the Psionic Machine Type 1 in the magazine's June 1956 edition. And these are the covers for the American and English editions of Astounding from that time. You can see at the bottom here, Psionic Machine Type 1. So, as we've already discovered, the device made no sense according to any familiar scientific principles. Campbell reasoned, therefore, that it worked through psychotronic or psionic or psychic means. The electrical components weren't really doing anything. They were just there to harness and channel the innate, as yet unknown abilities of the human operator, perhaps in this case through psychometry, the alleged psychic ability to gain information about an object by touch. So this is where you should clutch your wishing machines, please. So to test this theory that the box itself did nothing and it was merely about focusing human psychic abilities, Campbell built a symbolic version of the machine, or he designed, I should say, a symbolic version of the machine that included all the elements, a pickup coil on the bottom left here, with a prism that's in the middle, which says right, and we'll talk about your own take-home devices later, and a tuning dial, and a sensor pad on the right. But this was all a drawing. This was a two-dimensional drawing on paper that was reprinted in Astounding Science Fiction. And he wrote about this and printed these diagrams in the August 1956 issue of Astounding under the title Correction and Further Data on the Hieronymus Machine. The point was that the symbolic machine worked just as well as the physical machine. And this is where Harry Stein, who we met earlier, who cured his daughter's warts, discovered the device in the pages of Astounding. And he felt strongly that Campbell was perpetrating a clever hoax, and he built the symbolic device to prove it. And he was quite relieved to discover that it just didn't work. But then, looking at it a bit more closely, he noticed that Campbell's printed diagram had omitted a key symbolic filament for the symbolic vacuum tube. So he drew one in, and the machine worked as advertised for him and for everyone he presented it to at White Sands Missile Base. What's more, the symbolic device worked just like a machine, albeit a symbolic one. Every couple of years, Stein had to re-ink the battery symbols because the symbolic batteries would go dead when the ink faded. And he'd re-ink the vacuum tube symbol every 10 years to put in a new, fresh vacuum tube to keep it running smoothly. So, is this madness? Would the symbolic device have worked without the crucial filament for a less technically savvy user? The answer, Stein felt, was yes. It was just his technical know-how that allowed him to see the flaws in the device and make it work for himself, whereas someone who hadn't noticed that, it would have, he believed, worked just as well. However, Hieronymus Galen himself didn't agree, and he felt, while he admitted that the symbolic device also worked, he was tied to the physical and believed that the India ink used to draw the symbolic device had actually acted as a conductor of elliptic energies. But the point is that Campbell and Stein showed that Hieronymus's machine, in both mechanical and symbolic forms, was a magical object rather than a scientific one. And there's just no mainstream theoretical framework through which these devices can operate. Yet they do make sense on an intuitive or a magical level, fusing aspects of vitalism, electromagnetic field theory, and psychic science, particularly, say, telepathy, psychometry, and divining or dowsing. So it's... Oh, there's an early version of the diagram. So it's something, there's some sort of delicious irony in the fact that in 1954, Gerald Gardner, who you see here on the right, the founder of modern British witchcraft, wrote in his book, Witchcraft Today, that he uses radionics or radiesthesia as a sort of scientific backing for his suggestion that witchcraft works. He even references the cameras of George and Marjorie de la Warre, who we saw at the beginning of the talk. One of the superstitions, he writes, of ancient witchcraft was that there was some connection between part of a thing and the thing itself. So if you could get some of the blood, excrement, or hair of a person or animal, you could establish a link with them. 50 years ago, scientists would have united in saying that this was nonsense, that it was superstition, which it truly is, for there was no proof of it. Nowadays, however, many scientific men believe that living tissues emanate their own radiations in conformity with their cellular structure. A disease affecting these tissues superimposes its own radiations on those of the normal cell, and every disease has its own characteristic wave formation, so the patient need not be present. A specimen of blood or saliva is enough. And it's said that experiments with special cameras are being made which will record these changes in the cells. Radiesthesia, which was another term for radionics, is a faculty which some people possess of receiving waves or rays and passing them on through muscular reflexes to a divining rod or pendulum. It's what used to be called dowsing when used to find water, and it's probably the force behind table turning. And it's nowadays being investigated by a great number of medical men, priests, and research workers generally because they get results. So you have there the sort of perfect collision of witchcraft, the very origins of what we now recognize as British witchcraft, and radionic technology. So, where do we go from here? These electronic structures make no sense, writes Thomas Brown, author of Radionics at the Crossroads of Science and Magic. But the mystery of the black boxes is no mystery once one understands the relationship between form, matter, and energy. They are specialized tuning circuits operating on energies outside of the electromagnetic spectrum. And from an orthodox materialist perspective, these radionics boxes are simply cargo cult technology, a fantasy of science. But it's too simple to reject all of the devices and all of these ideas out of hand as deceptions or sleight of mind. After all, Harry Stein tried to do this, and he ended up writing a book stating that they all work. Instead, we can best try to understand them as technological adaptations of ancient sympathetic magical practices, a magic that requires the conviction of both the practitioner and the subject in order to work. And magic adapts with the times, as do its sorcerers. Some still prefer to deploy the medieval technology of puppets, for example, wax models of their subjects fitted with hair and nails, while others prefer the syncretic complexity of ritualized stagecraft and its attendant technical literature. And for others, these black boxes the black boxes of the radionics practitioner are more persuasive and still come back to, of course, to the blood, hair, and nails of the puppets of more traditional witchcraft. And some contemporary radionics practitioners prefer to emphasize and elaborate upon the electrical aspects of their technologies, while others dispense with them altogether. And perhaps the sort of most extreme example of this kind of reduction of radionic ideas, and I think they're quite beautiful, although the book is actually banned in America, is Don Gerard's 1990 book, The Paper Doctor, a Vibrational Medicine Cabinet. And here are some of his diagrams. So in Gerard's technique, which combines radionics with homeopathy, these radionically devised and dowsed energy patterns are simply placed upon a magnet over the accompanying remedy board. A teaspoon of water is placed on top of this and left for 5 minutes for the electromagnetic ghost properties of the cure to filter into the water and so make it an effective treatment. So you basically radionically divine the kind of physical, the two-dimensional properties of an illness or a virus or a bacteria. So map it out on the board, place it on the special plate, put some water on top, and there you have a kind of a remedy for that illness. If, as Arthur C Clarke famously observed, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, then can we accept that any sufficiently advanced magic is also indistinguishable from technology? Nowadays, a vast range of radionics devices can be found online, ranging from the ridiculous to the sublimely beautiful. That's, I would say, ridiculous. These made by Joseph Max in San Francisco are really quite incredible objects, and some are just impressive. This is one of my favorites because synthesizer fans will see that it looks very like the classic 1970s VCS3 Putney synth developed by members of the radiophonic workshop. But the synth is on the left, the radionic device is on the right. But indeed, there's a whole class of radionic devices that emit sound waves, which sort of then turns them into sort of strange synthesizers. And George and Marjorie de la Warr actually were the sort of leaders of the field of sonic radionic devices. So this one on the right is built by Kelly Research Technologies in Lakemont, Georgia, and will set you back a cool $4,500, which is still only about half the price of a VCS3, so it's maybe worth it. It's described as a 3-bank subtle energy powerhouse designed for daily management of agricultural assets, including crops, herds, and other animals, featuring silver Sephora geomantic amplification circuit, integrated subsystems, a homeopathic potentizer, pulse frequency generator, scalar field detector, magnetic clearing circuit, a 10-hour timer, so you don't have to be there the whole time that you're transmitting your radionic waves, and it's all comes in a beautiful hand-rubbed oak cabinet. And there's a whole, I won't go into it, but there's a whole sort of side story to the radionic history in which in the 1940s in Pennsylvania, a company actually developed radionic devices for pest control that were briefly approved by the local agricultural board. But I think it's fair to say, when you look at some of these devices, that however these radionics devices work, whether it's on a magical or a subtle energetic level, then the more beautiful the tools that you devise and build, the more effective they're going to be. And effective in this case might mean either persuading the practitioner and their subject that their tools are working, thus inducing some kind of potent placebo effect, or if you subscribe to an active energetic model, easing the practitioner into the necessary state of mind to fully potentize their innate healing abilities and then transmit the required energies to their subjects. But either way, these more decorative and well-developed boxes lead us into the world of art. And some artworks, as I think we can all accept, are just inherently magical. We all know what we mean when we talk about the power of art, and sometimes it can be overwhelming. Think of the extreme examples of hyperculturemia or Stendhal syndrome, or the alleged physiological and psychological positive or negative effects reported by visitors to crop circle on the bottom right, radionic devices above that sort of mirror some of the sort of same patterns. So art and magic both share their origins in the same ancient human activities. We might even view art as the tool for the technology and practice of magic. And through art and magic, our ancestors were able to forge bonds with each other and with their non-human counterparts. They learned mimicry and disguise, how to survive, how to hunt, how to represent and connect with the world of which they were a part. And we can see in this magical process of mimicry, communication, and empowerment at work in artworks, whether they're visual, sculptural, performative, or musical, that merge magical and scientific worldviews, just like the radionics devices, in their attempts to draw the world around them closer. So let's have a look at a couple of artists who might just as relevantly be called scientists, engineers, healers, or magicians, and whose work collapses and folds all the usual distinctions between art, magic, science, and technology. And their artworks are also magical technologies, like the Hieronymus Machine, complex systems in which human operators, be they the artist or the viewer, play a central role. And this is the Eloptic Nomohagraphon by Paul Lafferly, who sadly died just a year or two ago. And Lafferly, who was trained as an architect in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and studied art in Providence, Rhode Island, was actually worked under the designer of the World Trade Center, Frederick Keisler, who is also a collaborator with Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp. So he has a immaculate pedigree as an artist. Oh, sorry, the World Trade Center designer was Minoru Yamasaki, not Frederick Keisler, he was another sculptor, sorry. But after some contact experiences with sort of non-human entities of his own, he sort of retreated from this world, and since 1967 just lived and worked in his studio apartment, which he called the Boston Visionary Cell, where he just painted and developed his ideas. And there's a lifetime's exploration and learning encoded in his work. His large, dense canvases act simultaneously as active sourcebooks for the ideas and technologies that have inspired him, and as conduits for the energies, implicate and explicate, terrestrial and extraterrestrial, that they describe. And you can see, and these are huge, that's probably sort of 15 feet across, and you can see there's just incredibly dense text also worked into it. And if you can still your throbbing pineal gland long enough to read the small print here, you'll find references to Ted Sirius, who we mentioned earlier, and to Albert Abrahams and Thomas Galen Hieronymus. And you might recognize in the center there a variant of the Hieronymus device and the wishing machine that you are holding. And also on the left here is Lafferly's own assertion that the Turin shroud was actually a result of the eloptic energies of Jesus himself being burned onto the shroud. And the figure on the bottom right, you see a sort of human head and brain is wearing a radionic helmet, much like the one we saw earlier. Another explicitly psychotronic or psionic painting is this one, Planeton 3, and these are both from 1989. And this is based on a series of encounters that Lafferly had with an extraterrestrial being named Quasgar Klaatu. And as in the process of these encounters, Lafferly came to believe that the alien implanted something into his brain, some kind of technology that allowed him to work with ET technologies. So he himself, Lafferly, described how Klaatu showed him, quote, how to make the painting into a psychotronic or mind-matter interactive device, which is activated by approaching the painting, stretching out your arms, and touching the upright hands on either side, and staring into the eye. And by doing this, new information will be transmitted to you. And it's quite nice, you can see human hands and the alien handprints within it. And then you've got this kind of hypnotic radionic spiral in the center, as well as the eye above. And then these sort of thought form patterns at the bottom, and on the right, that's Quasgar Klaatu himself. And if there are any UFO buffs in the audience, you'll recognize Klaatu is obviously the name of the humanoid alien in The Day the Earth Stood Still, the 1951 science fiction film. and Quasgar was actually the name of an alien in a well-known Contact narrative. So all this stuff is actually kind of information that's been kind of compounded into Lafferly's output. So Thanaton 3, this painting, is a device for balancing the forces of life and death, past, present, and future, matter and spirit, and human and alien. And the coded information contained within it is imparted visually and textually in a fastidious, compact style, reflecting Lafferly's architectural training. But data is also transferred to the viewer on some other energetic radionic level, making this a psionic educational tool for re-engineering awareness. And perhaps a sort of less focused approach to radionic art came with Emery Blagden, who we see here. He died in 1986. This would have been in the mid-80s, this photograph. And he lived alone on a large farm in Nebraska, and where he was known to his neighbors as a kindly, though slightly strange, long-haired recluse. And he'd spent his early life traveling as a hobo during the Great Depression before inheriting this farm from his uncle. And in the mid-1950s, and I would like to imagine he might have seen some of the descriptions of radionic devices in astounding science fiction, but we obviously can't prove that. He began construction of what he called his healing machine in a shed on the farm, and for the next 30 years he just filled it with an interconnected network of hanging mobiles, kinetic sculptures, and assemblages built from wire, wood, metal, and paper, and whatever else he could find. We know that he was keenly kept on top of new scientific developments, both in the mainstream and in the fringe, and experimented with earth energies, and maintained a perennial fascination with electricity, which he believed to hold powerful healing properties, which actually isn't such a strange idea. That there is evidence to suggest that running electrical current through physical wounds will help them to heal more quickly. And he so took this quite literally, where he'd run electrical cables around the barn and attach them to all these sort of metal objects hang around, and then switch it all on, and people would go in and just say that their hair would stand on end when they went in there, and then they'd leave because it didn't feel very safe. But I like to think of him as a kind of sort of rural version of Nikola Tesla, who conducted similar, perhaps more educated experiments a few decades earlier in New York City and out in Colorado. But whether or not the scrapyard shaman had access to radionic concepts and technologies, his own healing machinery comes across as a spectacular radionic workshop. The twists and turns of his intricate metal structures designed to capture, channel, and amplify unspecified energies, whether they be etheric, telluric, or elliptic, to positive healing effect. His sculptures are an instinctive, totemic, and animistic embodiment of the energetic world, and one so powerful that anyone who encounters them can intuitively grasp their purpose. And it's a bit a slightly sad story in that for him, the barn with all that was just festooned with this material was the healing machine, and after his death, the only way to protect his work was it was broken up, and there's now pieces of it in galleries all around the world. So it's until it's all brought together in one place, I don't think it will ever work again as he intended. So, like all radionic devices, it was a perfect collision of ancient magic, intuition, and the technology appropriate for its time. And then, look, you can see more of him in his barn there. And it was just discovered quite by luck. He was discovered by a local, I can't remember, he wasn't an art professor, but a university professor whose family lived nearby, and he got to know him. and was able to preserve the work after his death. More recently, this is at a Turner Prize entry from 2006 by the artist Mark Titchener, actually also called The Wishing Machine, and quite brilliantly, Mark encouraged visitors to use the machine and try to steer the judges of the Turner Prize psychically to give him the award, which didn't actually work, unfortunately. It was given to Thomas Atts, but it was a nice try, Mark. Well done. But the important point is that magic adapts for its times, and radionics is ultimately a magical practice emerging out of what were almost certainly misguided technical and scientific concepts, has also adapted. And here we see purely digital computer-based radionics adaptations that have appropriated the symbology and aesthetics of both magical and radionic traditions to create a kind of convincing and persuasive whole. And these kinds of dashboards, you can basically tune different audio frequencies and you'll get visual readouts and things, and sort of hypnotic patterns emerge that, again, are just sort of designed to induce you into a kind of state of connectedness to the vibrational world through your portal into the internet. And these are sort of things that are still available online, sort of energetic ones and USB sticks. And of course, as with all magical forms, it has its dark side, and this is the Psionic Predator, which is a form of sort of psychotronic radionic attack magic for sort of defense and punishment of your enemies. I don't recommend it. These are high-end, very expensive sort of radionic machines that will set you back a few thousand and come with chunky ring-bound manuals. Radionics is a broad church, and ultimately, whatever we think about the ethics involved in radionic practice and the sale of these radionic devices, as they're never really sold as healing devices, I think it's just sold as kind of meditation devices usually. Once we understand the history of radionics, as I hope I've helped you to see today, you can recognize its place, I think quite an important place, in the thriving world of alternative beliefs, technologies, arts and medicines, and I suspect they'll never be going away. Okay, thanks very much. And I'll just tell you a little bit about your take-home wishing machines. I mean, what I would suggest you do is cut out a little triangle of paper and attach it with a clip to the, let's go back to, so you can see it properly. Attach with a clip to the sort of dial at the center. Oh. Maybe there. There we are. So yeah, the central dial is where you would, with a clip, attach a sort of triangle of paper that you can use as a kind of pointer. Then on the right-hand side, the sensor pad is where you just sort of gently rub with your hands or a finger just to kind of feel for a kind of sticking point, a point where it catches, and the point that as you're gradually turning the dial, and the point where it catches and where you've got the dial is then the kind of correct frequency for transmission. And the witness well up on the top left is where you want to put your sample of whether it's whatever it is you want to affect. So it could be a photograph of a loved one, some hair that you've creepily clipped from them during the night, blood sample if you can get one, and then you can work your magic from there. But this is obviously quite a pared down version of the wishing machine, but it should work effectively for you. If it helps, you can connect batteries to the power point there, and you can just do that with alligator clips attached to a 9-volt battery. That tends to work quite well. And maybe if you're quite technologically minded, you could attach sort of LEDs to the battery, so you know whether it's on or off at any given time. But it should work for you. I make no guarantees, but it's worth a shot. And I will. There's actually a friend of mine who's been working with radionic ideas. Dan Wilson actually developed a radionic website where people could use their trackpad of their laptop as a kind of sensor pad to also sort of use as a tuning device. And he got people to write what they wanted their kind of thoughts to do for them. So things from making their lawn grow to helping them to become healthy or lose weight. And then he actually turned these into a kind of musical performance, which works very nicely, using all the frequencies that were sent in from the users online. So if you have a look for radionics radio, that's another nice thing to look for. And he actually made a great record out of these sort of wishes that were sent in to the website. Okay. Are there any questions? I appreciate that's quite a lot to take in for one talk, and I'm happy to backtrack and kind of focus on any of the elements that are of interest. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Hello. It's sort of broad though, and
that's okay.
How the sci-fi magazine, the amazing.
The what, sorry?
The magazine that the
astounding science fiction. Yeah.
Science fiction. Was that a sort of pop culture thing?
Huge, yeah. That was a massive magazine, and it was a mixture of science fiction stories and sort of science fact.
So how much weight can we place on How much weight can we place on popular culture for sort of forging all these ideas?
A great deal. An astounding science fiction was considered considered quite a respectable magazine, even though like the caliber of authors was you'd have John Campbell himself, the editor, wrote the story Who Goes There, which became The Thing from Another World, which became The Thing, and people like Arthur C Clarke, Fritz Lieber, L. Ron Hubbard, obviously, Jack Williamson, a lot of very highly regarded writers, fantasy and science fiction writers at the time contributed. And I think the sort of science fact side was more Campbell's own, his own personal kind of interest that came into it. But, I mean, it's not something, you don't see this stuff in, I've never seen this stuff appear in a TV program or a comic or something. But the ideas that are kind of inherent in it are just the raw ideas of magic and witchcraft. So, and this is just one expression of those ideas, sort of for people with a sort of particularly technical or technological outlook or kind of focus in the world. So I think that, to me, what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting is that there's something inherently truthful about the ideas, and they go back, as a hint suggested, as a bit of it said briefly, but they go back to theosophical ideas about the vibratory universe, to early 19th century ideas about what we now, early sort of 19th century ideas of what we would now recognize as subatomic physics. So Baron von Reichenbach's odd was, people who were attempting to fill the vacuum, to fill the space around them, and were grasping at ideas that which now have a deeper scientific kind of framework around them, but people are grasping at the fact that when you're doing this is not vacuum. This is a world filled with with stuff, whatever you want to call it, whether it's orgone, odd, you know, vibration, dark matter, you know, quarks, whatever it might be, electrons. So people are just grasping at the sense that there is, you know, we are sort of moving through a sea of stuff. And these devices and our ways of kind of harnessing that stuff and sort of tuning it, and this is the idea that, you know, it's being tuned to your to become a tool for your use and for whatever purpose you want it to. So, but yeah, it doesn't. It's in. You can find it in pop culture, but I don't think it's expressly, you know, other than the Astounding Science Fiction magazines. I don't think it's ever been really thoroughly explored. And Lafferty very explicit in his artworks, which, you know, when I first came across them in the 90s, were pretty far out, and, you know, you couldn't see them anywhere. And then, as just in a good way, as such things happen, you know, he was exhibited at the Hayward Gallery in London 3 or 4 years ago, and that's just how things happen. But he is very explicitly was engaging with these ideas, and I think it was him and Mark Titchener, obviously, again, was explicitly working with them. But I don't think, I haven't seen them anywhere else. William Burroughs, the American novelist, was a very keen advocate of them, but I'm not aware of them ever. You know, in his journals and letters and things, he talks about it, but I don't think they occur in any of his books. But he recommended the Harry Stein Strange Machines That You Can Build book when Stein was the missile engineer. So I think he may have mentioned it in lectures and things like that. So, but yeah, so it's a very, very, you know, it's always been a very sort of underground world. There was a guy, Tony Bassett, in Camden in London, who had a stall in Camden Lock, and he used to sell radionic devices and he sold time machines and things from there, and theremins. He's mainly actually built theremins, and the Spice Girls. He was always very pleased the Spice Girls used one. But he was also I went round to his home once, and turned out he was a big radionics enthusiast. Actually, he also, another separate, I only found this out recently, he'd built ionizing lightning generators for Throbbing Gristle for them to use during performances in the 70s. So he was quite a figure on the underground scene. Yes, he was probably the first person I came across who was was a connected radionic user, as it were. Yeah, a couple more.
Hello. I just figured that during all your research, it would have been really hard to resist dabbling yourself with a bit. So I'd be curious to hear about some of your experiences and experiments.
Yeah, I didn't get much further than I didn't join. I went to meet the UK Radionics Society and subscribed to their journal, which was not really a journal, more of a little zine. And they were, at the time, this would have been about 15 years ago, they were undergoing a big period of change. It all changed hands, and it wasn't a good time to get involved, I would say. But what I was trying to do was get hold of some of the technology, because the machines themselves, you saw briefly the George de la Warr in front of them, they look like massive 1950s synthesizers, and they're just walls of dials and switches and sort of readouts, and some of them, as I say, actually produce sonic frequencies. But I didn't manage to get hold of any at that time. And Dan Wilson, who I mentioned, he has actually built up a bit, but he's built up a bit of a collection now. So we're hoping one day to do some kind of exhibition of them. Yeah, I didn't. I sort of, because I inherently understood the some magical elements of it, and I'd done my magical practice sort of in the past. I sort of felt I sort of knew where it all sat. So I wouldn't say I actually worked with the technology as such. I did build the Symbolic machine and played around with that, and perhaps as a result at that time, amazingly, this was when I was living in central London. I was sat outside a cafe in very central London, and a kind of quite buff man, it must have been summer, very well built guy in like sporting gear, walked past the table. I was sat outside a cafe, and he had this tattooed onto his lower arm, and I just stopped him and said, "You have a Hieronymus Device tattooed onto your arm?" And he said, "Yes." And when I rub it, when I want to make things happen in my life, I use it as a kind of magical tool. I thought he'd let me take a photograph of it. I should have incorporated it into the talk. But I thought, this is incredible. What are the chances of that happening? It was at the time I was sort of most sort of deeply involved in this research. So I think, I felt that was if you're working with magic, those are the sort of things that make you feel good about what you're doing. But yeah, I do have one or two pieces of the kit, but they're sort of, again, it's a bit like a sort of modular synthesizer. If you can have one piece and plug it in, but it won't do anything unless it's connected to lots of other pieces, and I don't have the other pieces. But maybe one day. But I don't know. I mean, the tragedy is, because the sort of heyday of all the sort of analog gear was the 1950s, a lot of this stuff was just, being chucked out or left in attics, or sort of no one would have known. They would have just been sort of black Bakelite boxes with dials and switches on that nobody would have known what to do with, so they were just probably trashed, most of them. And they weren't. They were made in their hundreds at most. But yeah, I'm never. And the gear you buy online is too expensive. Is now too expensive to want to experiment with, sadly. So yes, that's sort of answers your question, but it doesn't really. I haven't. I essentially didn't throw myself fully into kind of building up a radionic workshop, but I dabbled, perhaps. So there was another question down the front.
Yeah, I suppose it's just like curiosity, because I was reading quite recently a biography of Marjorie Cameron, and it talked about Jack Parsons and his links to people like Hubbard and that kind of 50s West Coast. So I just wondered, because obviously they were very into that, the Crowley kind of occult, and this seems to have come from a different place, and so I was just curious about what the connections were.
Yeah, the connection is really interesting. I mean, there would have been connections in that. So this is John W. Parsons, Jack Parsons, who was one of the founders of Jet Propulsion Laboratories, whose technologies eventually took Americans to the moon, sort of 20 years later. And Parsons was also a practicing occultist magician in the Aleister Crowley School in Pasadena, I think, California, wasn't it? Soon to be a major TV series about him called Strange Angel, based on a very good book. Anyway, the thing with Parsons is he was a member of the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society, where you would find a lot of the contributors to astounding science fiction would have been members. Hubbard was a member, and that's how they knew each other. Jack Williamson was a member. I think Fritz Leiber was a member. Kenneth Anger, the filmmaker, was a member. So that was a real hub of kind of, far out, but educated, far out, sort of progressive thought. But Campbell, I don't think Campbell himself was part of it, but but as I say, certainly a lot of the members were, and I would imagine that possibly Campbell, if he was passing through LA, would have certainly come to meet them and things. Weirdly, I mean, there's no mention in any of. I've read 2 biographies of Parsons and looked at, seen published diaries and things. and that he doesn't ever talk about this stuff. But he died in what, 56 or so? Died in the 50s, mid 50s. So it might have just been slightly the wrong time. But his interests also were travel, whether it's or sort of travel out of space or traveling into inner space or kind of magical space. So I don't know if this would it wasn't really a sort of this sort of technology is primarily focused on healing and things. Having said that, actually around that same time, that's when the agricultural uses of radionics were starting to be developed. But also the thing was that at that time the technologies were presented as technology, not as the magical side of it is something that really is something I've sort of overlaid onto it. I don't think no one at the time would have presented it as magic, although Campbell sort of saw it as psionic, which was also considered sort of a form at that time. Again, it was the peak period for parapsychological experimentation at the big universities in the States, like Duke and Princeton. So it was still considered science, basically, not magic. So it wouldn't have been. I don't think Parsons would have approached it as a magical thing. But certainly, he's very much in the same cultural sphere that this is all happening in, and is a very, very interesting character. That's right. It's a pleasure. It's a bit. I sort of always worry it's a bit much for people. There's one more person here.
All right. Sorry. Well,
hi.
Don't know how this thing works. Okay, here we are. I don't know if there's anybody else in the audience who's in a similar position, but I'm a radionic practitioner.
Are you? Amazing.
I'm a member of
Okay.
British Society of Dowsers and the Radionic Association.
Fantastic. Great.
And I'm also practicing witchcraft.
That's
member of Pagan Federation.
fantastic. So, that's really great to hear.
I got introduced to radionics from from a perspective of total skepticism and absolute disbelief. And one of the things that it was the demonstration of the effect on the patient, and it was pretty remarkable over a first 13-day course of treatment, that made me suddenly question my worldview and suddenly think, hang on a minute, is all this stuff I've been brought up to believe absolute fact, or is there something else involved? So I'm very pragmatic, very feet on the ground. I've got no science fiction, UFO illusions or delusions or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What interests me is efficacy, right, and results. And one of the things that I'm always concerned about from discussions to do with radionics or radiesthesia, which in France is health dowsing, is the focus on the technology rather than the results. And one of the things that concerns me greatly, and this is something that's going on with debates going on with homeopathy and NHS, etc. at the moment, is the focus on what we don't know rather than the actual outcomes. And if you look at, I'm not going to try and justify anything about what I do in terms of science, because I don't think there is any answers at this time. But the thing that I do question about in terms of science, in terms of what is science, science is an observation of things that actually happen, and then to try and work back to see how they occur and work out the mechanisms for that. And that's where theories and hypotheses come from. Where I see a lot of what's going on nowadays, and I think there's a certain hardening of attitudes throughout society, and that's not just to do with belief systems, it's also to do with political attitudes as well. There's been a great sea change since the 1950s and 60s in that. Is this attitude that if we can't understand how something works, it can't work. And that's not true. Apples fell from trees before Newton discovered gravity. So a lot of what I view is on how things work is that at some point science will come up with an answer to this, in which case it will become mainstream, right? But until then, I'm more interested in focusing on the outcomes rather than the mechanism. But I thank you for your talk.
Oh, thank you, and that's absolutely amazing. I mean, you're the living embodiment of what I feel to be the case, that that witchcraft and radio technology are very much operating. And do you feel your practice with witchcraft and your practice and experience with radionics, do you see them as two different things, or do you see them as a similar thing?
There's, I think where you're looking at in terms of parallels between witchcraft and radionics is the idea of focused intent changing material reality. And in modern physics, we look at von Neumann's observer effect, and also you're relating the idea between using a witness as a hair or blood sample and actually making physical changes. I mean, that chimes in with Bell's theorem of non-locality and quantum entanglement. So there are things there which are parallels, which are coming to a point. But I think it's important in terms of radionics to define what it is and what it is not, because otherwise you tend to end up with this mishmash of everything becomes everything else. And I think some of the defining things about radionics are the rates, the idea that everything can be described in either a numeric or a geometric form, and that can be used in place of the actual thing. In some ways, these were originally based on Malcolm Ray's theories about how to, define rates in a geometric way, and Ray moved a long way beyond that. But so rates, the fact that treating people over distance is irrelevant. They can be in the next room or next continent. You mentioned things about placebo effect. I've treated animals very successfully, and also in America, after Ruth Drown was tried and jailed for practicing radionics on humans, and they outlawed radionic treatment of humans in America, they still continued to allow agricultural treatments of radionics, which they do today, which is why Kelly machines are still manufactured. And that's because there's a demand from the farming community, because it works. Yeah. So the idea that we don't know how something works means it can't work. I think that idea has to go. Yeah. Because if we base our ideas of discovery on what we know, we'll never actually discover anything fundamentally new.
Yeah, I'm absolutely right with you there. And I would hope from the talk, I fully accept and appreciate that it works for. I think the thing is that it works for the people it works for, and it doesn't work for the people it doesn't work for. But I would, would you say that it will, if you have the frequency guides and you have the technology, would you say it will always work for people, or there will be times when it won't work? Sorry, I've turned it. Sorry to turn it around.
Take this home, yeah. What I've found is that I'm pleasantly surprised when I get a positive outcome. But in terms of the visual healing process, it's quite dramatic, and it's photographable if somebody wants to take pictures of progress of healing, and that's been done. There's plenty of photographs of cases in radionic association archives of treatment of things like horses, and this is one area where radionics is actually used quite a lot, whereas mainstream is in the stable community with kind of show jumping racing horses. It's basically known as putting a horse on a black box. And these people are pretty hard-nosed with a lot of money, sure, and they don't invest in this stuff lightly. So they're looking for results. In terms of dowsing, I've got a friend of mine up in the northeast, Deb Bell, who's a water dowser, professional water dowser. She's been dowsing for 20-odd years. Her father for water. That's all she does, just dowses water. Her father owns a drilling company, and she learned after she left university from an old bloke who he used to employ to find holes. And the first time she did a professional job after 3 years training with this guy, she'd actually been tricked because the client had already had a geosurvey done, so he knew where the water was. So they drove her out to the site and basically said, just walk down this hill, tell us what you find. And off she went, plotted centre, came back, wrote a report. So you don't just say drill here, you have to say the water is going to be this amount of flow, it's at this depth, this is the kind of chemical content, because if you're going to feed it to cattle you want to make sure that it's potable. This is the kind of strata you're going to have to drill through. And when they got her back, the client phoned her up the following day and said that compared to the geosurvey she was out by 18 inches and it was 2,500 feet down. So there's a lot of money involved in that. If people get it wrong, clients stop ringing you because it's tens of thousands of pounds to drill holes.
And you hear a lot from water boards all around the country about dowsing being used as a standard technique for...
Yeah, and the people who do it, because it's cheap, and the people who do it aren't necessarily highly trained or educated. They do it because it works, it's practical.
So do you think that the radionic ideas are closer to whatever's going on with dowsing than they are to the ideas that are so present in sympathetic magic and...
I think we have to be able to dowse to be able to use a radionics instrument of whatever type, whether you use a stick pad or a pendulum. But in terms of the ideas of focus and intent, that has commonalities within traditional witchcraft. And these ideas, as you say, have been around for millennia. You know, it's how they're manifest. But the main difference is with the idea of a radionic instrument is it's a type of capture and hold mechanism. Because if you've got 8 hours to spend on a patient, that's great, but you burn yourself out really quickly. Whereas if you can set a machine to, in terms, do a broadcast, although it's not actually broadcasting anything, right, to achieve that effect, then you can then move on to somebody else or something else. Go off to work.
Yeah.
Right.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. Brilliant. I actually meant to say at the beginning to ask if there were any practitioners here, but yeah, I might have a chat after actually.